and welcome to the Media Roundtable, Industry Edition. If you've been keeping up with us, we've spent the last few years talking to leading voices in podcast about what they create, why they create it, and the impact they want it to have on the world. This is a true roundtable format, and like we say in the name, this is our Industry Edition. So it's going to be less focused on creators and more about how media and audio industry experts can adapt to the news of the day. I'm your host, Jennifer Lane, and today I'm joined by a few of my colleagues. Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road. Tamara Nelson, founder and CEO of Barometer, and Gary Brown, who handles new business development for Oxford Road. Just a quick note before we get started. This episode was recorded last week as we wanted to recap our time speaking from the stage at Podcast Movement, as well as provide perspective on the events that transpired when Ben Shapiro showed up at Podcast Movement in Dallas, representing the Daily Wire, a major sponsor of Podcast Movement. The thoughts and perspective we gave are in response to a tweet we directly reference in the episode. Since we've recorded this episode, they have deleted that tweet and released a new tweet stating, "We're listening to our podcast community, many of who've been with us from the start. We're putting in place policies to guide our social media and events with inclusivity, diversity, and respect for all. It's a journey. We'll keep listening, keep growing." Once you listen to this episode, you'll understand just exactly how that fits into our conversation. So keep listening. We thought about re-recording our show, but chose to share it with you as is. We stand behind our comments, and we're standing alongside Podcast Movement as they've taken this first step in addressing challenges that continue to face the industry. But just to be clear, Podcast Movement, we'd still like you guys to come on the show. So without further ado, welcome to the Media Roundtable. Okay, so let's dive in. While I was away, Podcast Movement happened. There's a bit of controversy. There were some really powerful talks delivered from stages, and everybody who's anybody in the podcast industry was there. So I want to dive in first to what was happening with Ben Shapiro. We've seen a lot of it on the news, whether on Twitter or on LinkedIn or other news channels. Who can give us, actually, Tamara, do you want to give us a brief overview of what happened without any perspective or objectivity, and then I'll read a tweet from Podcast Movement describing what happened.
Yeah, so from what I gathered, Ben Shapiro was there. And he appeared on the public expo floor. From what I gathered, he had no actual speaking engagements or anything, any presentations, and he was at the Daily Wire booth. They had a really big presence at the conference, on the main floor. So yeah, that's what happened. He was there.
Okay, so then fast forward to what Twitter what Twitter released that sent ablaze, because Podcast Movement posted, "Hi folks, we owe you an apology before sessions kick off for the day. Yesterday afternoon, Ben Shapiro briefly visited the Podcast Movement 22 Expo arena near the Daily Wire booth. Though he was not registered or expected, we take full responsibility for the harm done by his presence." Then later in the feed, they went down further and said, "There's no way around it. We agreed to sell the Daily Wire a first-time booth based on the company's large presence in podcasting. The weight of that decision is now painfully clear. Shapiro is a co-founder of Daily Wire. A drop-in, however unlikely, should have been considered a possibility." So Dan, I know that you went on LinkedIn, so I want to hear sort of your perspective. But before we dive into that, Tamara, Gary, was this your experience while you were while you're in Dallas? Did you feel that this was a great response? Was it what type of response did it elicit?
Yeah, I had no idea that it actually happened until after I saw the tweet. So his actual presence really had no effect on me. I heard from somebody else that he was an honored guest at a retirement party that was happening at the conference too. So that was, when I heard that, I was like, oh, neat, Ben Shapiro went to this retirement party, but I had no idea that this had caused this uproar, and the tweet was a total shock to me.
So you didn't see an uproar?
I didn't really notice anything on the ground. Yeah.
Gary?
Yeah, same. I just walked out of Dan and Tamara's panel, and I was talking to old colleagues, from all sides of the political spectrum, and just catching up. And then he just walks by, and I don't know if you guys know this, but he grew up 2 streets over from me and is friends with my neighbors. So everyone in the neighborhood congregated on our cul-de-sac to play when we were kids. And I'm convinced that he played sports on our street. So in my mind, I'm like, I haven't seen this guy in 30 years since we've been playing on the streets. So I was like, do you remember me? It's good to see you. Like, great. You know, we're big supporters and partners of your network and your show. And I just was like, cool, he's showing up at this thing. And I heard that he was there for a retirement party and honestly didn't think anything of it. They had a booth there. Their network had a booth there like everyone else did. And I left Thursday. I didn't really hear about all this commotion till Friday. And I was like totally shook because he was there for the retirement party. Like he had no speaking engagement. So it was just a little, I was a little thrown off, not from like a political piece, but like he's grown a really big network. He's been in this space a long time. So for a lot of the people going to podcast movement, whether you like him or not, you should look to see how he built his network. He's got one of the largest shows, one of the most profitable networks. So it's just.
Yeah. And not to mention that news is literally the most monetized category, according to the IAB's fiscal year 2021 report. It's like 90% of all the revenue last year went to news. So it was a little bit weird that like one of these biggest revenue generating spaces, their network was being kind of excluded.
Yeah. And I thought like after reading it and digesting, like I kept thinking about thoughts over the weekend and I'm like, well, what really offended people? Is it his comments? Was it his presence? Was it like an anti-Semitic thing? Was it someone that wasn't happy that their network didn't pick them up? Like there's a lot of things to think about, you know, and it's like, what was the root of this controversy?
Well, Dan, I know you had a piece on it and Ben actually retweeted or shared one of the posts that you've put out. What's your take?
Yeah, it's a bummer, I think, is my take, because on one hand you have podcast movement, right, which has become the de facto like opportunities for the industry to gather around enthusiasm for what the podcast industry is and represents and where we're trying to go together. That doesn't, there was never an understanding or expectation that this was for people of a certain type of thinking, or that, you know, this was a political movement, right? It was, to me, a movement of what podcast is, and the thing that always drew me personally and is the reason that Oxford Road was able to be created, was we saw an opportunity for a renaissance that was predicated on conversation in long form to explore topics that formerly couldn't get funded and monetized, and you couldn't build an industry around radio when you were limited by signals. Now, all of a sudden, all the barriers to entry come down, and we can create these affinity groups around all kinds of topics and explore things in ways we could never do as an industry. And the movement is really about diversity. It's about differences. It's about people being able to find common ground with people, regardless of location, and to workshop different ideas, as we've done on this very podcast. We created this podcast because we saw problems happening in the world around us and wanted to use our platform to be part of that solution. To me, that's what podcast is about. So it was, first and foremost, it was jarring to see podcast movement all of a sudden announce that they have a position. They're going to draw a line in the sand and exclude somebody and basically reject somebody that they had already accepted money from and had never said, we don't want to be affiliated with this type of thinking. After the fact, they made a rule on that was never reflected in their communications, on their website, in their invitations, in their daily newsletter. This was new information to everybody that they were going to be drawing these types of lines. So that was upsetting, I think, as a member of the podcast community and as somebody that's participated for the last 2 years. You guys have been there. Tamara and I got to speak this year. Jennifer, we got to speak last year with Vanessa, and everything that we've been talking about is trying to create tools to help us unify. And this felt like the most divisive move they could have made. On the other hand, you know, truth be told, I've known Ben Shapiro for over a decade. Before he had his podcast, we have done business for a number of years. He came to us when he launched his podcast and said, hey, can you help us get some advertisers? Our agency filled his show with all of their first sponsors. Like we had like 10 advertisers going to his show who all saw tremendous growth from that. And then all of a sudden he became Ben Shapiro to everybody. People didn't really know him before. And he was somebody that we've had a relationship with. And so for me to see somebody that I have known, that I have done business with, that had a really, I think, positive experience working with, really just shunned publicly, also really, really upsetting personally. I mean, this is the problem going on in our country and in our community. It's seeping in a new way. So I felt a responsibility to say something, and to say something fast, and to say, this is not okay. This is not the movement that we want to be a part of. And what's going to be interesting is to see what happens next. I can tell you that when I posted that, I was very nervous because I said some things about my own political views that I don't normally try to do. I thought I was taking a risk because I know a lot of people have negative opinions about Ben, and some of the views that he has may not be the most compassionate positions to take, and they may not be things that I would say, and certainly not the ways that I would express them. But I decided to take a defensive position with him and wondered what the impact was going to be. I didn't know if we'd have clients finding problems with this or just get a lot of online hate. But really what was, I think, encouraging to me is that even though we're in this political polarized environment everywhere we go, and it's come into our, it came onto our doorstep, I have seen virtually unanimous feedback of people saying, this was not right. This was not okay. And Podcast Movement should have handled this in a different way. Now, in the spirit of reconciliation, that is the basis for this show and everything that we've been doing. For those of you that don't know, Jennifer and I have been working for more than 2 years to figure out how professionally we can make headway on this issue. And you've all been a part of that. It's really heartening to see that people who disagree with Ben Shapiro saying, no, we don't want to see things continue this way. And I want to be a part of a conversation with Podcast Movement. I want us to be a part of a conversation with Podcast Movement. I have solicited them through our newsletter. I have contacted the CEO directly. I have not heard anything back. I've seen nothing since the tweet was made. But I am hopeful that we can actually engage in a good faith discussion about this, because they're in a hard position. They have to now decide that they made an apology, and then there's huge backlash on their apology. And so what do? And so a lot to say here. I think to bottom line it for me, and then I want to hear more about what you guys think about where can they go from here. But like the bedrock of all this for me is, how do we move forward in a way that allows us to collaborate across differences? How can we not define a movement based on people on one side of the spectrum? Can we find something that is unifying and allows us to deal with complex issues that we have differences of opinion on, but we can still work together in a positive way to enlighten each other in this process? Can there be redemption from this? I hope so. And I think that if it doesn't happen from Podcast Movement, it's going to happen from somewhere else, and we're going to be a part of that solution.
I mean,
hope Podcast Movement comes forward.
It's already happened because of Podcast Movement, and not necessarily,
Yeah.
I'm not giving them a compliment, but
Yeah.
I mean, I don't necessarily know if we would have seen this type of reaction 2 years ago, 1 year ago, but they did something that incited a response in everybody. And that response has been objective, agnostic, and angry that a cancel culture style event had happened completely unnecessarily. So in one regard, like, thanks for really screwing up, Podcast Movement, because this is the first time we've seen a really positive across political line response unanimously in support of freedom of speech, freedom of voice matters. So I think they don't deserve a trophy for it by any stretch, but they have done something, and now
Inadvertently, they may have helped out, right?
now they need to actually do something.
Well, and so it's an interesting marketing question though, right? Because like, if you're them, imagine you're their PR firm, or imagine you're an advisor to the podcast movement organization.
Well,
What
this
are
isn't
your
going to be a very
options?
popular topic. I actually pitched this to Vice years ago. Remember when Vice was having real internal trouble and they were really making mistakes, and I was at dinner with one of the senior executives there, and he was just sort of venting about it, and I was like, oh my gosh, you guys need to do Vice on Vice. Like, you blow up so many insider news stories, like do Vice on Vice. And that's what podcast needs to do. Podcast movement needs to do. They need to do like a panel of discussions on themselves, like invite people from all sides, have Ben Shapiro host it. Like, I genuinely think they need to open up and say, like, we tried to do right, we did wrong, help us figure it out. Like, help us figure it out.
And I feel like you as an agency kind of you have the perspective of seeing all of the content on both sides. And I feel like on the listener side and on the other, like if you're the network or the creator of a certain type of content, you don't have that same visibility into the other camp's content. And so you can effectively walk all of the groups, but most people are locked into the group that they're a part of. And so I feel like what's really missing, and I'm pretty biased when I say this, is like an objective way of looking at all of the content all together to be able to show that, like, I mean, you can look up Ben Shapiro and you can see that, like, what his content is like and what's actually in his content from an objective third-party perspective, and align that with maybe the podcast that you listen to on a daily basis that's not Ben Shapiro, and find the truth there, or like the lack of things that you might consider offensive, and realize that maybe you were just offended because of the identity politics and not so much because of his actual, like, presence.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys are suggesting a position of humility and openness rather than just a response to their response, right?
Well, look, like, humility here is actually strength, I think. Like, they're in a really dangerous position, and if the next step isn't some acknowledgement of what may have gone wrong, like, they're gonna lose a lot of their power, I think.
Gary, you were going to say something on this, I think.
Yeah, I just think like they should, well, two things. One, like if you think about the polarization from a political piece, the networks themselves, like if you look at a Cadence 13 or a Crooked Media and a Daily Wire, they agree on podcast as a medium to drive impressions. They agree on podcasting from a monetization platform. They also are thinking about impression delivery with like Art19 and ad platforms and pixels and stuff like that. So they already agree on a lot of fundamental principles within the space in itself. They just have different positions politically. And I think what would be cool if podcast movement wanted to redeem themselves or whatever they want to do, it'd be really cool to have like a Ben Shapiro and a Jon Favreau on a stage together talking about, you know, just the industry, talking about their growth. You know, I think that's what people would want to hear.
So here's something interesting. So when we started this media roundtable process, I had conversations with folks at Crooked, and I had conversations with folks at Daily Wire. And one of the things we were trying to achieve was to create a platform where people from opposite sides of the spectrum would come together and find points of agreement, and also have differences, but in a respectful way. There wasn't enough trust for anybody to want to do that. There wasn't enough interest in creating rules of engagement to be able to have that type of conversation. And I think a lot of people's perspective, and I think my former perspective, was that, like, you know, we're all business people here. Let's focus on business. Let's figure out, you know, let's make this a trade show and not have to get into all these complex, like, social issues.
Right.
But at the same time, like, you can't get away from them, obviously. And
yeah,
it's interesting. Part of the work that we did, sorry, go ahead, Gary.
No, I just think now is a perfect time, because what if Jon Favreau does agree that Ben Shapiro should have been there from a trade show perspective, right? Like, you have.
I think we should ask him.
You have them agreeing on a certain thing. You know what I mean? Like, there it is, right? Because all these players are saying what podcast movement did was wrong, right? And you may say the sky is bright blue. I may say it's dark blue, but like, we're agreeing right now that what they did was wrong. And that's the play to bring it together. And instead of talking about politics or positions on global interests, maybe talk about how they feel about the evolution of tracking or ad insertion and like fundamentals about the industry, and just get them talking about something that they could both agree on.
Well, that would be interesting. So also note that the Media Roundtable is not just a podcast. We really started out creating resources to help deal with these types of thorny issues. And so, for example, we created a partnership with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And oh gosh, what is Bob's group, Jennifer?
No, it's the Cambridge negotiation.
Cambridge negotiation. Yeah, exactly. So we were, as part of our effort here to not just create nutrition labels for media, which Tamara has, made amazing industry strides for advertisers to be able to do, but we tried to say, like, look, if you get caught in the middle of a sudden controversy, everybody screws this up. Everybody finds out that something happened that upset somebody, and they get accused on Twitter of something, or they get a complaint, and then they react too fast. So what we did was we reached out to these third-party groups that are all about reconciliation, negotiation, and peacemaking, and said, okay, can you be a resource to people in our industry and actually help broker some of this stuff and actually try to find common ground? And it's amazing, like, here we are it's like so meta. It's in the middle of our industry, in the event for our industry, and there's all this inter-industry controversy now happening. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could bring forth some of those resources to actually try to find a mediated solution that actually takes interest in both stakeholder concerns? Because, let me throw something else out there, that even though I'm really frustrated and sad about Podcast Movement's response, I think we also have to acknowledge that something had to happen that they felt like that was an appropriate response. Something had to happen with Ben, where there was a position that he took. Maybe he took it in a way that was less about trying to honor deep held fundamental religious values that he might have. Maybe there was just a lack of compassion for people that are different that started it. And now we get into this eye for an eye revenge cycle where we're all just trying to react to each other, and we don't have to have compassion for Ben Shapiro because he didn't have compassion for them, but all we're doing is burning each other's houses down. What if we could also acknowledge that, like, hey, maybe there are things that he could have done different that preceded this, and maybe he'd be open to that feedback if it came in the right way. And maybe Podcast Movement, maybe we could hear their perspective, but also acknowledge that they could have handled this in a lot of different ways that they chose not to. And I would love, because this is all we've been trying to do with this show. This is all we've been trying to do. I'd love for us to play a part in that process. And so it's complicated, but it does give me hope that not everybody wants to just cancel each other, and that there may be paths to restoration and redemption and reconciliation that haven't been unearthed yet. And by the way, none of this is mutually exclusive with a growing industry and growing profits for all stakeholders. You can make money while doing right by each other. And that's what we've been trying to do here these last few years. And you guys have all been a big part of that.
Yeah. So now I think that plays well into transitioning into the normal format of our show, which addresses industry news. And it will be, my article is up first, which is about Twitter and podcasts. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what type of content they're featuring, because they are showing pre-selected content. So podcasts are coming to Twitter. The company announced late Thursday. Shows appear in the redesigned Spaces tab. However, you will not be able to choose individual shows. The interface gives pre-selected shows in topic-based playlists called stations. It uses RSS feeds and is curated from what people you follow listen to. A spokesperson is told input, there's no search functionality nor the ability to add your own RSS feeds. They're describing it as a test, and it'll be available to random users around the world in English. So, I mean, this sort of goes, the way they built it out goes against everything that we've been talking to about differences of opinion and not putting yourself into an isolated little thought reinforcing bubble, and the dangers that could cause. And the directionality seems like a pretty interesting choice. Like, yeah, of course, if you listen to it, it's like, oh, do I want recommendations from my friends? Yes, I absolutely do. But I think the beauty of the podcast format and searchability on both iTunes or Apple Music, sorry, and Spotify is the things that they deliver to you are stuff you would never find that your friends aren't listening to. And guess what? Like whenever people are talking with their friends, it's like, oh, I found this new podcast. And it's like you actually, the social currency of being able to describe this show to your friends is part of the beauty of it. And so if it's already happening in the background and you just are receiving like 15 cooking shows because your mom is always sending you recipes or posting stuff like that on Twitter, like it doesn't seem like it's the best format, one. And two, do people even want to listen to podcast on Twitter? Like everybody listens to podcast on podcast channels that or podcast platforms that exist already. So what do you guys think? Am I totally off base? What am I missing?
I mean, Twitter. So first of all, I had like 7 Twitter followers, and then with this Ben Shapiro thing, he retweeted the story that the Blaze did on this, and then all of a sudden I got like 40 more followers. So I can't usually do Twitter because I'm too long-winded, and so I can only like podcast or blog. Yeah, exactly. No, I can't. So I can't normally participate, but what I can tell you is that I really experienced in real time, kind of digging into this issue, how addictive it is and how you get pulled into this really messy, confusing world where you're inspired and stimulated, and then you feel disgusting over and over and over again, and like you can't get out of it. But I do think that there is power in Twitter. The problem is that I don't think they really are serious about this, and there's too much up in the air at that corporation right now. I mean, what happened to their Clubhouse iteration? Like, wasn't that going to be the thing a year ago?
Well, it was just, yeah,
and
it
then
was
it goes by the. Yeah, they go in halfway, they dip their toe in, and like, Facebook's going to get in a podcast, and then they're not. It's like we're seeing these media companies change course so fast on these things. I wouldn't invest a lot of time into this. I'd want to check in like 6 months and see if it's still a priority for them. Also, who owns Twitter at that time? Like, there's too many unknowns, but obviously people are into audio. Last point I want to make on this is that there was a story that Ashley Carmen broke like in the last few days, talking about how the age of influencers moving on to podcasts is dead. And her research basically suggested that all these networks were going, oh, do you have a big Twitter following? Oh, do you have a big TikTok following, a YouTube following? Great. Start a podcast and you'll be successful. But you know what? Just because you do cool videos doesn't mean that you can have an interesting hour-long discussion and that that's going to be compelling. It doesn't always translate. And I think with Twitter, what they may find is just because somebody had something interesting to say on Twitter in short form doesn't mean the podcast is going to translate either. And so I think sometimes we're making a lot of assumptions about if you just take it from over here and put it in there, that it's going to work. It doesn't always cross over in that way. So that's my podcast response to a Twitter topic.
At the end of 2022, it's projected podcasts to be a $2 billion industry, right? And if Twitter is trying to be acquired, to be sold, whatever, I think they're trying to generate as many opportunities or channels for additional revenue. And Dan, you know this quote, it's fish where the fish are. And if they need to generate revenue from podcasts or generate additional revenue and it's a $2 billion industry, why not try to put their hand in it too? If they can aggregate content or curate content.
My one thought about this is like, I mean, I think it's like ironic because Twitter is like the place where no synthesis is possible because there's like a character limit. And then that's like the whole reason why podcast exists and has this whole like following and people are engaged with it and actually want that long form conversation. So I think it's like, I think it might like break Twitter. Like when people suddenly start having more than just like a little quip to base their whole opinion on, like, wow, I hope that it has a positive impact on the otherwise like kind of dark reality of using Twitter. But with the way that they're implementing it, it seems unlikely because it's just going to reinforce the existing echo chambers.
Yeah, agreed. And so speaking of other platforms jumping in, everybody's jumping in trying to copy TikTok or replicate some of TikTok's success. Same is true. I mean, Snapchat has been one of those companies that's trying to replicate what TikTok has done really well. And so, Gary, you presented a story about Snapchat reducing their head count by 20%. What's the summary of what's happening here?
I just thought it was interesting. They're reducing their headcount by 20%. They had just under 6,500 employees, according to the SEC in Q2. And then like the CEO is talking about now they're refocused on community growth, revenue growth, and augmented reality. And augmented reality is the new thing and it's hip, and that's where people should be going. Community growth, sure, but like my big concern is like, where was revenue growth prioritized before? Like if you don't have revenue, you ain't got nothing. You know what I mean? It's only going to be cool for so long. And they're citing inflation and interest rate increases as part of the layoffs as well. And it's like, how long is the runway for something to try to be cool or to build a product that's going to generate enough revenue to have a long enough runway to continue this cycle? So I think people are catching on, investors are catching on, and money is not as cheap as and easy as it was to get prior, but that was the concerning thing, is like revenue, right? Like what keeps your lights on? Like having a cool product doesn't mean that the lights are going to stay on, right?
So as a daily Snapchat user, I can tell you that the ads that I get on Snapchat are completely without bounds, like compared to the ads that I would get on other channels. They appear to not really be targeted at me. Like I get like 15 McDonald's ads every week. I don't think I've eaten at McDonald's in like 15 years. And I also get targeted prescription drug advertisements. Like I get 8 Vyvanse ads a day. Like no doctor has ever diagnosed me with ADHD, but I have found a lot of value out of their influencer marketing. So I'm sure they're getting paid somewhere, but it does seem like they're spending a lot of overhead on managing their like influencer community. So I'm really curious to see where this goes.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And like in a totally different skew to that, the information has done a really good job of following this story. I mean, Evan helped create the social web as we know it. It was an article that they put out today, and it was talking about how they are laying off 20% of their workforce due to catering stock price down 79% this year. And now, I mean, 2 key executives left to go to Netflix, and they're restructuring their business to focus on community growth, revenue growth, and augmented reality, and how the changes have been really hard to navigate. And I think like with all of these creator economies coming up, and now, I mean, I don't know, I don't use Snapchat, so I'd be curious to hear like how are creators able to monetize their channels?
Yeah, so it's a pretty cool influencer marketing like marketplace where there's like this whole new channel or a new section of the app that's not your friends. And at first I was like kind of put off by this, but you find like micro influencers basically, and they have like sponsorships from brands, and they just vlog all day and like short form vlogs about how they're using their teeth whitening kit and like how they're getting their lashes longer with like some like lash thing. It seemed like pretty like that's currently
Well, and
how
are
it
those
is.
I would be curious to know if those sort of vlogging content produced or creator content produced ads are more relevant to the type of content that you're looking through, or are they as irrelevant as the McDonald's ads that they're sending your way?
Those are relevant. And you follow the micro influencers that like are similar to you, but then it's like the bigger influencers that aren't really doing the affiliate marketing and they aren't really doing those things. Their content is spliced with these like targeted ads that seem totally out of place. So that's what's kind of confusing.
Interesting.
Maybe they just have so much inventory they need to run ads to meet impression counts and pacing reports. And
well, definitely something to keep tracking. I mean, if it's happening at Snapchat, we'll have to keep tracking how it's happening across the social web in general. But go ahead.
Sorry, just one quick note. We did this extrapolation for with one of our VCs about the future state of the podcast market in 2026 compared to the influencer market. And podcast is going to hit 30 billion by like 2028. And by then, influencer will be at 16. So we're like poised to overcome influencer marketing in just a couple of years here.
Wow. Well, and that's, I mean, so actually, I'm going to totally tee you up for something here because I know, I mean, influencers, as we found in podcasts, get in trouble for saying the wrong things, a host of a show, whether they're doing it in real life or they're doing it on the show. And I know through the work that you're doing with Barometer, you're building a tool to track this and add more transparency in real time. Could you walk us through a little bit about like how you decided to produce something like this and what the end result would be?
Yeah, absolutely. It very much came as a reaction to learning that brands take issue with being associated with stuff that's not just in the content itself, but in the outside of the transcript lives of the influencer, the host, or the guests. And so what we did was we started looking at the news about these hosts and about these guests. And sometimes with like we track 50,000 different news sources, including the bot generated news that basically anytime anybody important tweets, they make a news story out of that. So we even get insight into like the most controversial social content. And we really found that brands told us that they had been Googling hosts and guests, even as far back as like 10 years, but they were particularly interested in not having to keep up with every single host that they're buying every single week and having some ability to have like a notification or an alert that a host sentiment is changing in real time in response to something going on in their lives. So,
and so you're
Mhm.
tracking change in sentiment, but you're tracking both positive change and negative change, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the way that we kind of target that is by looking at not just like the overall article and the sentiment of the article. Like I feel like that's pretty meaningless, but actually getting at the sentences or the discussion that either directly reference the person, the entity in question, the host or the guest, or the sentences that reference that entity, even if they are not named directly. And so by getting that more nuanced take and understanding that targeted sentiment, it provides more context than just saying like, oh, overall article sentiment.
Yeah. Well, cannot wait. I know it's coming out. I think it's being released in the next couple of weeks. So really excited to see it and really excited to start using it at our agency as well. But speaking about this shift from podcast to, or from, I guess, Snapchat to Hollywood, whereas those two executives went from Snapchat to Netflix, Cadence 13 hired an executive from Hollywood. Dan, walk us through what happened there.
So Cadence 13, which is part of our friends at Odyssey, they hired Hollywood executive Patton Valentine, I hope I'm saying his name right, to oversee their IP adaptation strategy. Basically, what they're doing, you've seen some of this happening already, but they're not just making podcasts. They're going, okay, how do we create a podcast that's going to transfer to something that you can stream on one of the big providers, right? You're seeing more and more of this. It's interesting that a company that was a radio native is now thinking about these terms. And I want to give credit to Odyssey because I think that the stock market has not been friendly to them lately. They're always, getting called out because they're going to get delisted or whatever. But I think David Field has actually made a lot of strategic moves. And I think this is one of them where he's playing a long game and he's really working on quality and building a system with integrity. And I think this is an example of that, where he's not just going for the low hanging fruit of like, what's the most sensational thing? How do I get a celebrity to get on a show that we can then exploit and get some quick bucks for? They're like really playing a long game here. And I think when you look at the content that Cadence 13 is investing in, they're trying to create stuff that is substantive and evergreen and not as disposable as some of the, it's not just a real, it's not a reality show repurposed onto a podcast. And so I think you're gonna, I think what it says about the industry, though, separate from Odyssey, is like, you're starting to see people think about podcasts in different ways. And here's how I think about it. I think that a podcast could be a standalone business that you have, where you have a lane and you create content and you're going to have advertisers come sponsor that. That's what kind of the baseline expectation for a podcast is. You've got hobbyists that now make up the long tail, where you hear that Spotify has over 5 million podcasts in the library. Not enough of them. I don't care if Anchor can help monetize the long tail. Nobody's going to pay their bills with this. There are millions of people making podcasts that are not going to pay their bills with it. So as a hobbyist, it's interesting. But what the commercial application is for other groups is that it can be like an extension of your business, like a newsletter. And there can be real value in creating a podcast to have conversations. And I think Media Roundtable is a good example of this. We don't sell ads in this show, so we don't even try to monetize it directly, but indirectly, the conversations that it facilitates, the way it changes our thinking, the way that it creates awareness for our thinking in the marketplace, and the way that it's led to introductions like Tamara. You know, we met Tamara because we had a listener of this podcast go, you need to meet this person. You're both working on similar stuff. And now we've created this beautiful partnership with the work that she's done with Barometer out of that. And a podcast can serve that. Probably the most prestigious application of a podcast is what we're talking about here, where you go, all right, we're going to use it as a testing bed to get a proof of concept on an idea that we think could make it onto a screen where it makes more money. And if it works there, maybe it'll work in the other way. So, you know, it's the notion of fire bullets before you fire missiles. Podcast is a low barrier to entry, low cost way to trial balloon a concept before you double down and try to make it something that people are going to, you know, pay a subscription to stream in the future.
Yeah, I
And
think
that's
I
what we're
think
seeing
that's
here.
one really good way. I think another really good way is actually the exact opposite. And I don't think either way is stronger or less strong. But it's, I think, the example of like Only Murders in the Building, like crazy successful comedy show on Hulu. And there's only so much that you could watch in one episode, but after it's an extension of the conversation with your audience in a way that you can never dedicate on-air content to in the same way as you could in producing a show. So like behind the scenes content, or what they're doing, there's one with The Office as well, and it's like hearing the back stories of where the content came from, or in this scene this happened and you guys didn't know. And like I think it's a really great way of extending on-air content and having more of a genuine personal interaction with your audience in a way that you just couldn't ever facilitate in another medium at scale.
I just think like
Totally agree.
It's kind of this, like, it's what everyone else is doing. I mean, you look at what Sony's doing, you look at what Amazon's doing with their podcast, what Wondery is Amazon, but it's like that's the thing. It's a war of the worlds all over again, right? And how can you take this concept, like Dan was saying, adapt it to audio, and did it get downloads? How'd the advertisers do? Was there high engagement? Was there low, churn from the audience? Okay, maybe we should test it into a scripted production. But I think it's like, what's the next thing? Because everyone's already been doing this. Everyone's trying to follow the Dirty John concept. Are they going to talk about, like, could you imagine the Michael Jordan ESPN piece from a couple years ago as like a podcast narrative, then adapting that into a 12-part feature? Like, that's kind of what I'm thinking about. And to gain more interest, it always can't be about the true crimes or the unsolved murders or the mysteries. It's like, what's the sports story? What's the feel good? Like, what's the Disney safe, Aladdin type story that's going to translate into that? Because if you think about the audience, right, we're growing, the age is increasing. You're looking at these kids on TikTok, then they go to YouTube, then that YouTube influencer has a podcast, and then they're going to be on the radio, and then they might have a TV show. So you have to follow this progression.
They grow up so fast.
Yeah, but like they have to follow this linear progression. And I think this is another way to captivate audience and get listeners to a platform that's growing. Again, going back to my revenue thing from before, it's a $2 billion industry this year, right? So if it's growing, I mean, from 2017 to 2021, the industry like doubled. So what's going to happen in the next 4 years, and then the next 4 years? And it's just like this exponential growth. And I think people are testing their hands to generate revenue. I mean, if you look at stock price, like Twitter or Snapchat, down what, 78%, Jennifer?
79.
Like, yeah, like as a stockholder, you don't want to hear that. You want to hear about what the channels are for potential revenue growth. And like, is this something you want to invest in? And I think, to a degree, people are forced to do this.
Well, before I ask you for your stock tips, which we'll do off air post interview.
I don't have it.
It's a different podcast. Gary's stock tips. Can I just say one thing
tips.
about Gary? Because we've never had him on the podcast before. Is that so Gary and I have been working together since 2010 when we worked at Clear Channel before it was iHeart. and we had a little room that we worked out of, and I bought Gary a microphone so that he could do a podcast called Gary Makes Cold Calls, and cold calls is like prank calls. It's like you're halfway to making a prank call when you do a cold call. You're just trying to make money. But it was so entertaining to listen to him do it. And I'm so glad that you're here now, Gary, 12 years later, actually being a part of this content creation process. But I really hope, in addition to your Stock Tip podcast, you also finally launch the first season of Gary Makes Cold Calls.
Well, look, I will tell you,
because I'm going to listen. I will sponsor.
And the host. Listen, I'm grateful and thankful for the opportunity to be on the show, and I hope I could be back in future episodes.
Time will tell.
Dan bought me this really cool microphone. I have it here on my desk. It's a blue microphone. It's not hooked up to anything, but it's really cool. It's like this fixture on my desk, and I thought about it. I'm like, I should hook this up and just really get a microphone boom and just take it seriously.
Well, one thing that is so can't wait. We'll give you free commercial space on our podcast one time, 15 seconds.
Free promo.
Listen, I'm about that CPM and the brand safety upcharge, and you know, we're gonna talk about revenue growth. We're gonna revenue grow this podcast. Do you know what I mean? Like,
one cold call at a time.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So moving. Can't wait.
All right. Thank you for letting me derail with that.
Tomorrow, Veritone launches an AI voice network.
Yes, so very soon, Gary will be able to continue working while the AI in his voice basically creates cold call content. So Veritone launched this cool thing called the Veritone Voice Network, which is a multilingual custom AI voice solution and podcast monetization service that combines synthetic voice creation and AI-powered translation to localize podcasts and grow ad revenues and audiences, to quote their LinkedIn post about this. So this is super exciting because there's all of this new research about the effectiveness of host-read ads, why we love host-read ads, produced host-read ads in addition to regular, like, baked-in ones. So this can potentially open up that space where you can just train a voice model by reading 30 sentences on the Veritone website, and then it makes a little model and you can type in anything you want, any script, and then it'll read it in any language. Now, I mean, that's huge. We're seeing international growth in the podcast space as well. So really kudos to AI, natural language processing increases in being able to do the AI transcription. That has been a game changer, being able to map onto a abstract common language that then you can map onto any other language. Huge gains in terms of that capability. So, I mean, there's already like half a dozen AI-based copy generation tools. So I'm really excited to see kind of what the future trajectory is of the AI-powered tools for the podcast industry.
Well, no one is more excited about extending host-read ads than Dan Granger. So I pass the microphone to you.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting one. I do want to hear Robo Gary making cold calls and doing live read endorsements. I think it's going to be tough, and I applaud Veritone, who one slice of Veritone is a direct competitor of ours. But I do think that they're pushing in an interesting direction, and they may have been too early on some of the things that they were doing before with trying to do targeting with AI, but the world may now be at a place, TechNet may now be at a place where this can actually be useful. And I think to the extent that you have a lot of safety protocols where the right people are approving voices before they actually go out into the world, because the misapplication can be a disaster, right? But it's a cool idea and could be very, very efficient for what we're trying to do. But as long as you're not taking a meaning that somebody didn't actually vouch for and assigning it in their voice, that's the power of it, but it's also the liability. And so it's going to have to be approached very, very sensitively.
Well, and as our AI expert on the call today, tomorrow, I guess like that is a really good point. How much accuracy could come through, one, but then even more complex, number two, how much localized contextualization can be implemented into this type of thing where something might make sense in America, but it wouldn't have the same strength or make the same sense in Japan, as an example.
Oh yeah, I mean the nuance is pretty crazy in terms of like what would be required to make stuff locally relevant. Like if you just take basic idiom, on the whole it's pretty straightforward. Like you can translate stuff in different languages, that's not new, but like computational linguistics expertise is really required to tailor this to different countries. I think Grammarly has modeled that very well. And like just taking an example like the idiom take five, like if you translate that to Chinese, that means something very bad. And if you translate that to Spanish, nobody's gonna know what you're talking about, like five of what. So there's a long grind ahead.
Well, and speaking of an area or a genre where context matters more than most, so Dan, comedy has topped charts in 2022. What's happening? You're on mute.
What's happening is that Edison is very quickly becoming an important third-party source for ratings. Number one, we've got all the tech in the world, but it's like the Tower of Babel. Nobody knows like what makes sense, because there's 22 different rating systems that are all partial or incomplete. Edison seems to be the front runner to get us away from trying to look at Apple charts to try to make sense of what's where. So that's number one. I think the integrity of the rating is the first part of the story. The second part of the story is that they basically said most of the listenership happens first in comedy and second in news. And I think my big takeaway from that is, number one, it's nice to see comedy hanging in there, because that was kind of the beginning of the industry. It was like all geeks and gamers and tech and these comedians. And like Adam Carolla was like, he kind of like crossed the Rubicon and helped come to and make this his primary platform. That was a profound moment for this industry. So I'm glad to see that comedy's still hanging in there. But what's interesting is that while these two genres take up the most share, they are also the two that are the most problematic for brands. What people say when they're being funny can be the most, potentially dangerous things for a brand to associate with. And as more big brands are coming in, that the two are at odds with each other. We talk a lot around here about news. We don't talk a lot about comedy. But I think that what's cool is that, Tamara is the ultimate case study for creating solutions so that brands can feel safe, making sure that there's alignment between what they believe and what their values are and what they are sponsoring in their communications. And so by actually taking inventory of what you believe as a company and what your priorities are for bias, for reliability, for sensitive issues, for the tone and way that you talk about delicate topics, these are things that can now be figured out with external tools before you go and spend money on it. And so I think it's a great opportunity, and it's a great thing for those that have been pushing and working to make this the largest share of the industry, but the tools are now required to make those useful from a monetization standpoint.
Well, fortunately for us, we have the creator of the only tool currently available in the market, which does this really well. Tamara, give us a brief description on how Barometer is addressing this topic specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like we've kind of been speaking to this all week, Gary, in the calls, and Jennifer, the calls that we've been in. But it's like comedy is like one of those genres that some people axe completely because of the perceived risk. And there's really quite a bit of nuance in comedy. But if your bucket is the size of a genre, you can't parse it beyond that. But we basically have built 11 additional buckets, or GARM has built these 11 buckets of ways that you can slice and dice content to understand how it aligns with your brand's policies along each of those 11 components. And from that point of view, I mean, There's comedy that doesn't talk at all about political issues. There's comedy that doesn't talk at all about adult issues. So for a brand who is understanding that like maybe they're sensitive to a particular type of comedy, prior to Barometer, there's been really no way to consistently and at scale enforce parsing that inventory to find the shows that are good for you. So if you know you want to monetize on comedy, you can now objectively parse through that content, pick example shows or pick shows that you can start running on that actually do meet your standards without axing it completely. And I heard this really great quote at Podcast Movement from somebody from the IAB who was there, and they were like, yeah, our goal is to obviously encourage more revenue to be spent to make people feel confident in their buys and to go at this with a scalpel rather than an axe. And I just love that metaphor, and I hope that we can be that scalpel.
Well, hopefully that scalpel is applied appropriately for what will inevitably leading comedy charts, Stock Tips with Gary, Cold Calls with Gary, and
Well,
you heard
listen,
it here
we have a
first.
recurring segment every time I'm on the show where I take
Where Tamara does
Yeah.
your live barometer reading.
Well, listen, I read about AlphaFold, like this new Google AI program that they bought that like replicated all these biological proteins in like 48 hours, which took like 50 years to do. And they bought this platform because of what it could do playing against people from on Atari, and then like this Chinese game called Go. And I'm thinking as I'm reading this, like, what's the progression of AI, right? Like in 3 years, can they replicate my voice? And it's like going from the Tupac hologram to like Gary makes cold calls completely automated through AI. Like it could be a recurring thing. I could make cold calls 24 hours.
And that to me is things of my nightmares. And AI.
I'll just make sure you're on the do not call list, Jennifer. It's easy. But going back to what you were talking about with the comedy piece, Tamara, like that came up last week with a new advertiser. You know, when we built the media plan for them, the data showed, I don't know the exact number, but say it should be 15% of their media should be focused towards comedy. And when we actually look back to see like what the actual mix was, it was more like 7 or 8%. And I checked in with the account manager and I actually talked to my point of contact, and they were just a little hesitant. They know there's mitigated risk with comedy and other less polarizing genres, but they were just not quite sure. And they want to make sure that like the program in itself, podcast in itself, is a positive medium for them. And I think it's like you're tiptoeing into the water. You know, it's like you're not just stepping in, you're just kind of cruising in. And I'm hopeful that this, with more awareness of the barometer piece, that should help mitigate the risk. And I tried to push it too on them. I'm like, look, we could show you these shows. We've got barometer, and they're keen on it. They're hip with it, but you know, it's just like a slow progression sometimes. But I'm hopeful that.
Well, that's why these nutrition labels are so important, so that they
Yeah.
don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because otherwise they just go, you know, they dictate out a whole genre, and they could be rewarding the right actors, the good actors in a genre, right, and not supporting the bad actors. And that's kind of everything we're trying to work on collectively here.
We can continue on this thread all day, but we are out of time. So thank you guys so much. Looking forward to continuing this conversation offline and in future episodes of the Media Roundtable. As always, this show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want to know not just what's in the news, but to use it for good. If you're a marketer looking to balance business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, and to Tamara's agency, or Tamara's company, Barometer. Visit Oxford Road at oxfordroad.com. Visit Barometer at thebarometer.co. Subscribe to either of our newsletters. And thank you so much to Bianca, Kyle, Dan, Stu, and the team at Podcast One, and to our special guests today, Gary and Tamara. Looking forward to having you guys back.